Hello, it is Kramer here. If my voice is a bit somber in contradistinction to the color of the slides, as you'll note, they are as cheery as I could come up with. That's a rainbow type flavor of color. Of course, this is the problem of evil, or the problems of evil for today. Excuse me. And the reading from William Rowe, The Problem of Evil and Some Varieties of Atheism. I start with the why the screw fly. I think we left off, in fact, with that cliffhanger from last time. And there you see an image of seemingly harmless fly. I am going to get into some of the details. And the details are graphic and terrible, because this is the problem of evil. This is not the problem of why do I have to go to class? That's so agonizing. Actually, you don't have to go to class. Why do I have to listen to lectures? How about that? That's not the problem of evil. And it's kind of hard to get a sense exactly what the problem of evil is for many in the United States today. Even in the midst of what's going on with the pandemic, it is not obvious the scope of what is meant by the problem of evil. If you don't like the word evil, other terms for it are the problem of horrendous suffering, or in particular with Rowe's example, William Rowe's example, the problem of gratuitous suffering. Gratuitous, as we'll see, just means extra. It means ultimately unnecessary. Gratuity. This is when I used to wait tables. They call it, I guess they still call it gratuity. I find that to be a disgusting term. When you go to tip your waiters, waitresses, people who bring food to you, a lot of people getting that these days. That's not gratuitous. It's not merely extra. That's what the people live off of. And it upset me to no end when I was told I'm just getting extra stuff. No, that's my salary. Anyway, gratuitous means extra, unnecessary. And so when I start with the question, why the screw fly? And it's not even the worst. It's not even the worst, as you probably imagine, of what is possible on Earth today. So again, there's just I should probably have a trigger warning, I believe is the phrase now. This is going to be difficult, and it needs to be, to get a full sense of what's going on here. When you look out into the ocean here in Santa Barbara, look up into the mountains, it's hard to get a sense of what really is meant by the problem of evil historically. But then you get little glimpses of it. A couple years ago, we had the biggest wildfire in California history, and then immediately after that we had the mudslides here or just south of here excuse me, that killed 23 people. That brought it close to home, but we tend to forget. We tend to bypass these things happen, and then we move on. And I don't mean to make you in a bad mood any more than you might already be, so this is a tough lecture given the time period. But it is necessary to get a sense of what this problem is. By the way, the screw fly, you can look into it if you want. They aren't found in the U.S. as much as they used to be. I think we've eradicated them through a great deal of scientific endeavors. But they basically burrow into wounds, open wounds, and they lay eggs. And in some cases, they burrow, creating enormous and horrible pain. And in some cases, they travel into regions of the brain of the creatures that they burrow into, which could be anything from cattle to cats to dogs to people. And in some cases, they lead to a slow and horrible death. And we might ask, as does Rowe with his example of the unfortunate fawn, what benefit could this possibly bring? is this not an example of gratuitous suffering? Or, put another way, what in the world do we need screw flies for? There may be a biological evolutionary account for why there are screw flies. In fact, there is. But a design explanation, a reason for the screw fly, not a cause, but a reasons, insofar as explanation, is not obvious. Unless perhaps the designer is this dude. Slide 2 here, you've got Dr. Evil, of course. Just a bit of levity there. But if you recall from last time when we looked at Stephen Law briefly in his reversal of the problem of evil, it was called the problem of good. It was a kind of reductio ad absurdum, or sometimes referred to as parody arguments. The parody here is, imagine, somebody who believes that the designer of the universe is all evil. Well, evidence stands against that. There seems to be good in the world. There are, kittens and babies and beauty and cities like Santa Barbara. But, as we said from last time, all of that can be explained away. These things come crashing down, kittens get eaten by wolves, and so on. Excuse me. I'm fine, just something in the throat there. What is it about this universe, just this earth, or just us, human beings, that is obvious about the designer of us? If we go back to Paley and a number of arguments in contemporary philosophy and non-philosophers who argue for the existence of God, it is a common move to look at the human eye as what Dembski and his name just escaped me now. Excuse me, the philosopher and biologist who argues that the eye demonstrates an example of irreducible complexity, something that could not have come about through the accidents of evolution, but rather had to be designed. Perhaps that's the case. The eye is the exemplar of design. But if you'll note, according to the Vision Council of America, I'm not entirely sure what that is, so it may not be a legitimate source of information, but use your eyes. Look around. How many people do you see with glasses? And why do we need glasses? 75% of adults use some sort of vision correction. About 64% of them wear eyeglasses, and about 11%, that's not very much, wear contact lenses either exclusively or with glasses. Over half of all women and about 42% of men wear glasses. And even my son, Milo, pictured here, had to wear an eye patch for over a year. It was a miserable time trying to get him to wear an eye patch. He's fine now. An amazing optometrist, or ophthalmologist rather, performed surgery on his eyes to correct them, or both eyes. And he's doing just fine now, doesn't have to wear eye patches. But the human finite doctor had to correct the flaw in my son's eyes. And it wasn't my son's fault. Whose fault could it be? And if we're talking about a designer, it's hard to imagine it wouldn't have been the designer's fault. In addition to that, there are arguments going back to Richard Dawkins and others, and there's debates about this, but it seems pretty clear, and you can test this yourself if you look at the slide here, the blind spot demonstration. And here we find an example of, and this is slide 5 here, and you're to close one of your eyes, close your right eye, and look at nothing but the cross. Fixate on that cross. Start with about maybe 8 inches away from your screen, or from, if you print these out, the paper that you're looking at. Again, about 8 inches away from the screen. Close your right eye. Fixate on the cross in the middle, and slowly move back a bit, and you'll note that the other dot on the other side, the dot on the left, starts to disappear. And the reason that happens is because there's a blind spot, if you look on slide 6, right in the center of your eyeball. The back of your eyeball has a fairly significant blind spot, which we tend to not notice due to having binocular vision. which maybe there's a correction for it. But if this is a design, why would the optic nerve be right in the center of the back of the eye, thereby creating, this is the argument here, creating a blind spot but in both of our eyes? If the eyes are designed to see, why these blind spots? Why the optic nerve right in the center? The fibers of the optic nerve are going into the back of the eye, to the retina, and this causes a blankness. And you can ask further questions about the eyes. Why is it connected to the occipital cortex in the back of the brain? The eyes are in front, but the brain areas responsible for taking in the information is way in the back, which biologically speaking, anatomically speaking, seems to be an odd construction. Speaking of odd construction, why do we breathe and talk out of the same tubes that we take in food? According to the journal Injury Facts, in 2017, choking is the fourth, it's not that bad I guess, it's not great, but the fourth leading cause of unintentional injury or death. Unintentional. Well, that's interesting that I just noticed that the word unintentional is there. 5,051 people who died from choking, for example, in 2015. That's, if you look at all the numbers, that's not a whole lot. There may be more people who died of bee stings. But then that raises the question, what's the deal with people dying from bee stings? Why do people die from peanut injuries? Why do we have wisdom teeth? The foolishness of wisdom teeth. And there's a link there you could look into why we have wisdom teeth. Evolutionarily speaking, it's a nice little drawing there where the wisdom tooth's coming in sideways and saying, I'm sorry, other teeth. But it gets worse, especially if you are a woman and you choose to have children, or it's even worse if you don't and you end up having one. What's the deal with pregnancy? And if you look at the images, those are from the movie Somebody and Somebody Are Having a Baby. Actually, Seth Rogen and oh gosh, I should have put the information there. I'll put it up there when I look it up. Anyway, childbirth seems to be not ideal for bringing another human being into the world. My wife and I had a book, perhaps we had it out prematurely, about the truth about how children are born. And there's some detailed pictures, but there were drawings. And my daughter at the time was like 4 or 5, and she was looking at the images, and she asked, "What are these?" And she said, "Well, that's how babies are born." And she said, "No, it isn't," and dismissed it out of hand, and didn't go back to it since, actually. We probably need to go back to figure out how to inform her about that. Perhaps it was premature of us to show her that, but she was insistent that no. That's absurd. No way in hell that's where I came from. And it is extraordinarily painful to experience childbirth. I'm told it's difficult for women too. Sorry, that's the obligatory man joke about pregnancy. In any case, it seems an odd way of doing things. Related to that, why are our recreational areas the same as our potty regions? I don't know how to exactly put that. There's a comedian who I cannot find who had a wonderful joke about this, but you get the point. Recreation, of course, related to pro-recreation, if you want. That's good. Proud of myself for that one. I don't have pictures of that, but there are many of them if you're interested in porn. And who isn't? It's everywhere, which leads to yet another question. What's the deal with porn? What's the deal with humans that we have porn? And so much of it that it's almost a default when you look online for, I don't know, Socrates. How well are we made is the question. And one response is, as good as could be expected with the machinations of evolution. The anatomist Alice Roberts puts it this way: the human body is a hodgepodge of parts assembled in an untidy fashion with no foresight by evolution. This hodgepodge notion makes sense now, perhaps, of the platypus. That seems to be a creature that was not intentionally designed, but sort of came out after generations and generations of, selection for certain kinds of traits. And they build upon one another. As the eye develops over time, the structures of the brain develop over time, we have evolutionary explanations for why it would be as it is after so much evolutionary history. But as far as a design that was intentional from the outset, the human body is strange. Could you have designed a better human? Well, someone thinks yes. In fact, Alice Roberts, I think there's a if you click that link there, it's a YouTube video, YouTube video of this conception of a better body, where you see, instead of giving birth, the way that we saw in the previous slides, they're marsupials, and you can see all sorts of interesting things that she suggests that might be superior. According to Roberts, the perfect body, or a superior body than the ones we have, would have ears like cats and lungs like birds. Of course, these changes would require all sorts of other anatomical changes. Human legs, she says, would be more like ostrich legs, enabling to be much faster, enabling to avoid all the problems that we have with hips and knees. Why do we have so many hip and knee problems? Well, one easy response to that is so that, I've forgotten the word. What are they called when they replace hips and knees? Orthopedic surgeons, yes. So why are hips and knees so poorly made? So that orthopedic surgeons can have a job. Well, that's an odd way of putting it. That's confusing causes and reasons again. The fact that our hips and knees go bad does have a causal relation to there being jobs, employment of people who replace these things now. But it would be very strange if we were to say the reason our hips and knees and all other parts of us go bad is so that doctors have something to do. Believe it or not, that is a response. I've put it in a kind of caricatured way here, but that is a response to the problem of evil. Those are called theodicies. How can we explain the existence of these seemingly horrible situations, these bad designs? By the way, the next slide, 13, you see the example of somebody who's lost their limbs, and we have developed prosthetics, and the prosthetics look a little bit more like an ostrich legs, and they work really well. As you can see, this athlete, Pistorius, I think his name was, I think it's what it says there, is able to run incredibly fast using these ostrich-like prosthetics. Interestingly, I think Pistorius was accused, maybe convicted, I don't know, of murdering his girlfriend. So there's something unrelated to this, but it will be related to what we see with respect to moral evils. What I'm talking about here, the limitations of the human body, are akin to, are examples of natural evils. Why is it that the body degrades? Why is it that after a certain period we start to physically deteriorate? And by deteriorate, that's the right word. We have all sorts of drugs now, and if you watch commercials, you can see these drugs are directed primarily at men, baby boomers, who are worried about erectile dysfunction, which is a legitimate concern, who are worried about low testosterone, right? They want to keep in their 20s or whatever. By the way, 20s, those are some good years. Don't waste your 20s. And if you're out of your 20s, well, I'm sorry. Things only go downhill, but you get wiser. You get wiser until your brain stops to function as you want it to. and the concern, of course, of the rising rates of dementia, Alzheimer's, and so forth. We've talked about this before, and I don't want to dwell too much on it any more than I have to make the point that the problem of evil, in which we haven't even gotten into some of the worst parts, is vast. It has been around this issue philosophically, theologically, for quite some time. In addition to concerns about how we are made, we might ask, how well is the world itself made? You can go on with other issues about the human body if you want. It is an amazing designed or evolved thing, regardless. Excuse me. But it does seem inconsistent when we look at the flaws of the human body and the presumption that the designer is an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent entity. This is somewhat in chronological order when we look at how well the world was made, and that's a question, of course. And I'm leaving out all sorts of things. I can't possibly cover it all. The first is starting with Pompeii and natural disasters caused by, in this case, volcanic ash. You know the story of the whole city of Pompeii destroyed, encasing the entire city ultimately in molten ash, which left preserved the remains of people. It's actually quite awful. This is an example of a natural disaster. This is an example of natural evil. In philosophy, we have two kinds of evil: natural evils and moral evils. Thus far, we've been looking just at the natural evils, that which happens in the world and seems to happen whether or not human beings were here. Pompeii wouldn't have been a city, of course, without humans, but we can imagine the volcano still going off, and instead of killing all these humans, there were other animals, which indeed, of course, did happen. Animals were also consumed in this horrible, horrible volcanic ash. What about the great Lisbon earthquake of 1755? This is something that Voltaire wrote about. And in fact, in his novel Candide, talks about the absurdity of the view that this is the best of all possible worlds. Pangloss was one of the characters. He talks about Panglossian means someone who is naive and presumes, as Leibniz, the philosopher around prior to Voltaire, claimed that this was, of all possible worlds, the best possible one. That's something that we'll return to later on. But Voltaire was driven to poetry upon learning of the Lisbon earthquake. He says, quote, "Are you then sure the power which would create the universe and fix the laws of fate could not have found for man a proper place, but earthquakes must destroy the human race?" He had a lot more to say about that, and we can have a lot more to say about it when we look at other issues, something that's been obviously in the news for the past couple of months, reference to how well the world is made. In 1918, there was the flu pandemic, where 17 to 50 million deaths resulted. 17 to 50. That's a pretty wide gap of uncertainty. In any case, it's known that it was enormous, the number of deaths. More, in fact, than people who died in World War I, which, by the way, of course, is yet another kind of evil, warfare, that would be considered moral evil. Harms that people do to other people. By the way, World War I, 1914 to 1918, was known as the Great War. Interesting title. We name our wars, of course. That's for historical purposes. But the Great War didn't mean this is awesome. It did mean it was awesome. Awesome in its original sense of inspiring awe and fear. The technological advancements, the tanks, the flamethrowers, the biological warfare, the machine guns. All of this and the damage it could do to humans and in vast quantities led most people at the time to think, well, we're done with war after this. No one would be stupid enough to start another war, much less a world war. Surely this war is the war to end all wars, said in around 1918. And then the flu pandemic hit. Holy shit, what a horrible time that was. World War I, then the flu, then a couple more years, a decade or so later, you've got the Great Depression, which lasted for about 10 years. And then what do you have next? Since we call the Great War also World War I, that implies we've got to have another, and World War II. So anyone who lived during that time, my goodness, they've known suffering more than any other time in history, it would seem. Maybe I forgot the Black Plague. I didn't even mention that one. I don't have any images of that. But obviously, it didn't end. We didn't learn, and we had another world war. And we didn't learn. We have pandemics that are going to happen. They're tough to stop. But there's ways of being prepared, better prepared than perhaps some are. Tsunamis caused by earthquakes in 2004. Upwards of 230,000 people died in a matter of a day. And that happened, it seems, caused by an earthquake. We might ask, what was the reason for the earthquake? Do you see where we are? That's difficult to explain. Natural evil again with Puerto Rico, looking at images of it after Hurricane Maria. This was some 3 years ago now. Puerto Rico has basically been out of news cycles, but I can tell you they have not recovered. I'm not entirely sure how much assistance they have received. So what you have here is not just natural evil. Of course you have that. Hurricanes can't be stopped. But how we respond to these hurricanes, well, that may be in our power. And it's unclear that the United States has adequately responded to the recovery effort in Puerto Rico. And then, of course, here we are to today with COVID-19, coronavirus disease 2019. This is the image that you see everywhere. We're deep in the middle of it. It is a pandemic. It is awful. It is not the normal flu. And it is quite dangerous. And we've gotten confused over who's at risk and why they may be at risk. It seems to get everyone, right? This is the great leveler, people say. It gets everyone. And there's the natural evil part of it. Human free will seems to have nothing to do with this. And I think that's accurate for the most part. We're starting to get data now on who is being negatively affected disproportionately. And as is the case with every natural disaster, those who are receiving the brunt of the suffering are those who are already impoverished. This is the case with Katrina. If you go back to 2005, I think it was, when Katrina struck, it damaged areas, low-lying areas of New Orleans that were the more impoverished areas that were not well protected. There is a failure of monumental proportions by human beings. Couldn't stop the floods, but we could have perhaps built up the barriers around the city, excuse me, in such a way that it wouldn't have been as disastrous. We could have helped people leave. If you recall, well, I certainly recall, when people were leaving New Orleans because of the flooding, I recall a guy was being interviewed as he was leaving in his enormous SUV filled to the brim with stuff, and he said, well, this is the great leveler. Now we're all in it together. We're all starting from scratch as he flees the flooded cities, the flooded city in New Orleans. That's a confusion. They were not rendered all on the same footing. This did not affect everyone in the same way. Natural disasters do not. They negatively affect those who are already negatively affected. Societal ills, systemic problems. I'm not going to get into this here in detail, but there are moral dilemmas involved in why it is that so many people, for instance, in minority communities today, are succumbing to coronavirus because of so many underlying health issues. Why are there so many underlying health issues with among our minority populations? There is an answer to that, and largely has to do with systemic injustices within our healthcare system and within our system as such. So you see a perfect storm, so to speak, I can mix my metaphors, of natural evils melding with moral evils. Well, let's get a little bit more levity there. There's my cat Chloe, although I did call her an evil hunting juggernaut. The juggernaut is an unstoppable force, and while Chloe looks cute, she is, actually. She does look cute, and she is objectively cute to human beings who are large and safe from her claws and teeth. If you are a squirrel or a rabbit or a mole, have you ever heard a mole being eaten by a cat? I have, and it is unpleasant, to say the least. The moles are capable of screaming, and they do. And Chloe doesn't give a damn. She doesn't care. And she doesn't kill it to eat it, because if she did, she'd just eat it. She seems to toy with it. It does appear much like torture. I forgot birds. She also gets birds. And it seems, as William James said of this issue, that these birds that we see in the world are so beautiful and amazing, and signs of a just and good God. But to the worm, the bird is the devil. The bird that eats the worm. At least the bird eats it and then is done with it. Chloe tortures it. It seems quite awful. And it reminded me of the squirrel. The shitty life of the squirrel, represented here with it fleeing from threats on the ground, threats from hawks, threats from lawnmowers, threats from snakes, threats from dogs. You see here the squirrel has escaped the border collie, and then the next slide, no it didn't. That was a premature victory. I know that's not a border collie. I couldn't find a border collie with a squirrel hanging out of its mouth. But you get the point. You get the picture. Nature is red in tooth and claw, I think it was Thoreau said. And that's right. It's awful. I saw a squirrel, the previous school where I worked, a squirrel get attacked by a hawk. And the hawk was the size of Chloe, with wings. And it grabbed it and just slowly started eating it. And I couldn't look away. It was really quite awful. And I just looked at it, and then the hawk looked up at me as if to say, you have a problem? Or something like that. And I said to it, no, which is weird. I had an imaginary conversation. I said, I'm just watching. There was a distance. I backed up away. And it just kept eating. It knew I wasn't a threat to it. The squirrel's life is terrible. They appear to be in constant fear. And this is the case for most species on this planet. Most species on this planet are prey to other species. One might ask, why in the world would we design the universe, the earth, such that there were living creatures, presumably capable of feeling pain? And I mentioned the mole earlier. The mole seems to scream, at least as if in pain. It would be weird if it wasn't actually in pain. We might ask, why were these creatures given the capacity to feel, to suffer at all? And why is it that there are so many carnivores? Or omnivores, like humans. We can eat anything. And in fact, as the coronavirus is showing us, we will eat anything. And this seems to be a problem for the design argument. Why would we be designed to live off of the flesh of other living things? And by the way, can you think of anything worse than being eaten alive? That's pretty bad. And that's the fate of an enormous number of living creatures. In fact, so much so, and there's variations of what's the cause of the extinction of the various species, but if you take a class in biology, zoology, or maybe even paleontology, you will learn that more than 99% of all species, that is over 5 billion species that have ever lived on Earth, are estimated to have gone extinct. That means they are no more. The last member of their species is gone. We see this, of course, with dinosaurs, among many, many, many others. Presumably going extinct is not a pleasant scenario. And if that's the case for 99%, that's almost 100% failure rate. That means we have a 1% success of species surviving. This is that would be a poor grade, I would think. If somebody got a 1 on the test and it was out of 100, I would be sad and say, I don't think you studied for this test. You have more than failed. You almost got it 100% wrong. Now that's the case if we are concerned about these other species. Because, hey, humans are still here. But then you move to the next slide and you ask, how is it the case that we are still here? We move from natural evils, and it's not going to get any more pleasant, by the way, to moral evils. And, of course, the epitome, the exemplar of moral evil, of evils that human beings do to other humans, or to animals for that matter. Some might argue that factory farming is an instance of moral evil that humans perpetrate against billions and billions of chickens, cows, pigs, and so forth, as a kind of moral evil. Surely the Nazi Holocaust, the concentration camps, surely that is the epitome, that is the height of moral failure, of moral evil. And here you see the entrance to Auschwitz, the concentration camp. And notice the language we use: concentration camp, final solution. There's all sorts of euphemisms that we use to describe some of the most horrible, horrible things. To break things up a little bit, you recall I guess it's a joke. A survivor of the Holocaust meets God and tells God a Holocaust joke. God responds to this joke, "That's not funny." And then the survivor replies, "I guess you had to be there." So as I believe I've mentioned this joke before, this I heard from Ricky Gervais some time ago. I don't know. He didn't know where he got it. He'd heard it somewhere. It is a Holocaust joke. And typically if you start with, here's a Holocaust joke, you don't want to continue. You don't want to hear the rest of it. This is telling. This is insightful. This is an illustration of the problem of moral evil. Now, during World War II, those in the concentration camps were known to have remarked, "Where is God?" Where was God during the Holocaust? It was a common refrain after the fact, in which many Jews converted to atheism, changed their viewpoint. And one response to that is, where was man during the Holocaust? Which is an interesting reversal. And there is an answer to that, by the way. They were on the Western Front. The American forces, the Allied forces, the Russian forces as well, Soviet forces, they were on the Western Front trying to defeat the Nazis. Yeah, we probably knew about the Holocaust sooner than we let on, and maybe could have done something more, I don't know. The question, where was God, is not mitigated by the question, where was man during the Holocaust? And in fact, I might have mentioned this when we talked about the classical attributes of God: omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence. There are some who suffered through the Holocaust and doubled down on their, if you want, traditional, fundamental, or Christian, or conservative, perspectives of religious faith. There are others, Reform Judaism, that changes their conception of what God is. Omniscient, yes, all-knowing. Omnibenevolent, yes, all good, but not omnipotent. Where was God during the Holocaust? Well, God was there. God was suffering with the Jewish people. And God wanted to stop the suffering, but being not omnipotent, was incapable of doing so. And that's an interesting attempt at compromise, so to speak, given the realities. It's getting tiring. I'm going to skip through some of these. Moral evil, Assad's regime in Syria, where he's using chemical weapons on his own people. He's been doing this since 2015. There's evidence that he's continued to do it after the fact. There is the moral evil of the Real Housewives, in this case of New Jersey, but you can probably pick any of the Real Housewives of any of the cities and argue that they stand as yet another example of moral evil. Just a little bit of levity there. And then we move on again to other examples in which it's unclear. Here is a picture by Kevin, his name escapes me, photojournalist who took many pictures of sub-Saharan Africa, in particular of areas dealing in famine, warfare, starvation. And this image, which most people have seen, you see the vulture in the background waiting for the death of this child. It's one of the most moving pictures and the most difficult, illustrating a reality that hasn't gone away. And it should be known, the photojournalist who took this picture, a couple of years after having taken this particular picture, I believe, he ended up committing suicide. And the presumption is that his work in documenting unutterable suffering, horrendous suffering, was simply too much. And one can perhaps understand why. Now, why is it that, you can see the combination of moral and natural evil here. Droughts are something that's hard to avoid. But it could also be a matter of moral evil in a failure to distribute the resources that are there. The world has plenty of resources. In the United States, for instance, we've got a lot of food. We have so much food. In fact, we have hot dog eating competitions in which one man can consume as many hot dogs as, say, 40 normal mortal beings. And when you look at images like this, and then you look at images of hot dog eating contests in the United States, I think one might get a bit sick to one's stomach. Not just because hot dog eating contests are absolutely disgusting in and of themselves, but the obvious waste is just beyond absurdity. But that's a moral evil. How does this relate to God? Gratuitous moral and natural evils render God's existence absurd. And this is a quote from Galen Strawson. He's reviewing the work by James Rachels. He says, "It is an insult to God to believe in God." Now, we should stop right there. That's an amazing statement. And seemingly contradictory. But he goes on, for on the one hand, it is to suppose that he has perpetrated acts of incalculable cruelty. On the other hand, it is to suppose that he has perversely given his human creatures an instrument, their intellect, which must inevitably lead them, if they are dispassionate and honest, to deny his existence. That phrase, of course, may turn some of us off. If they are dispassionate and honest, to deny his existence. The assumption there is, if you do not deny the existence of God due to the problems of evil, you are overly passionate and or dishonest. Interesting. It is tempting, he goes on, to conclude that if he exists, it is the atheists and agnostics that he loves best among those with any pretensions to education, for they are the ones who have taken him most seriously. That's end quote. That's a tough one. That's a tough one to swallow. If one is an atheist, one might say, yeah, that's great. If one's a theist, one says, wait a minute, that's a bit much. Well, let's see. What is the problem of evil? We've already sort of addressed this. It's not this stock image of no pain, no gain. It's not me stubbing my toe and being in excruciating. It's not really excruciating pain. I'm fine, but it does hurt. That's not ultimately what we're talking about here. It's not being a little bit hungry because you haven't eaten in a couple of hours. Your kids will say, I'm starving. You're not starving. You're making me look like a horrible parent when you tell me you're starving. You haven't eaten in maybe 3 hours. And you can have food at any damn time you want. We have food in the refrigerator, in the kitchen. There's plenty of food. My children are not starving. They may be a little bit hungry, but they're not starving. I would prefer my children to say horrible bad words than to tell me that they're starving. That puts me off. I don't like people saying they're starving when they mean they're a little bit hungry. Because, of course, there are people who are starving. There's a lot of people who are starving. So, this no pain, no gain, being a little bit hungry, being a little bit tired or a little bit annoyed that you have to study or listen to lectures about the problem of evil and it's putting you in a bad mood. No, that's not it. The problem of evil is this. The philosopher of religion himself, Nicholas Walterstorff, puts it very well in an amazing tribute to his son, his very young son, who passed away. He says this about his son, who had just recently died. He is a center like no other, of memory and hope and knowledge and affection, which once inhabited the earth, is gone. Only a gap remains. A perspective on this world, unique in this world, which once moved about within this world, has been rubbed out. Only a void is left. There's nobody now who saw just what he saw, knows what he knew, remembers what he remembered, or loves what he loved. A person, an irreplaceable person, is gone. Never again will anyone apprehend the world quite the way that he did. End quote. There's a lot in that quote, and I'll return to it on occasion. Walterstorff is a theist. He is a philosopher of religion, and his confrontation with the problem of suffering, of horrendous suffering. The loss of a child is the problem of suffering. The loss of a parent, interestingly, is also, but not in the same way. So why? Why is this a problem? Where is the problem? You can go all the way back to Epicurus, 341 before the Common Era, very famous quote. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Well, then he's impotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he's malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Well, if that's the case, then how can we explain evil at all? That variation is something that Rowe expands upon. William Rowe, he died in 2015, by the way, so somewhat recently. He is going to offer an argument in support of atheism that is based upon a variation of the design argument. Excuse me, a variation of the argument from evil. I was reading that word as I said the other one. And the argument is straightforward. I'm going to give you a deductive version of it first, and then we'll look at his probabilistic reasoning after the fact. So the argument here, premise 1, God's omnipotent. We know that means all-powerful. Premise 2, God's omniscient. He's all-knowing. God is omnibenevolent, or morally perfect, perfectly good. Those are the classic attributes of God. You can put them all into one premise if you wished. I've broken it up to 3. The fourth claim, the one that he's going to focus on in this paper, there is evil. Evil exists. If you don't like that word again, you can say there is horrendous, gratuitous suffering. And by the way, the deductive argument is less concerned with whether it's gratuitous suffering, gratuitous evils, or necessary. Any evil at all in this creation, given premises 1 through 3, omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, is inconsistent. And the deductive argument leads to the necessary conclusion, the history of this goes, that there cannot be an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God. But let me finish the argument. Premise 4 says there is evil. Premise 5, if God is omnipotent, he would be able to prevent all of the evil in the world and all the suffering in the world. Premise 6, if God is omniscient, he would know about all the evil and the suffering of the world and would know how to eliminate it, or at least prevent it. And if God is perfectly good, he would want to prevent all the evil and suffering in the world. So, God is either not omnipotent, but maybe the other two, not omniscient, excuse me, but maybe the other two, or not perfectly good. In other words, God, there is no all omnis God. One way around this is to simply say, no, premise 4 is false. There is no evil. And in fact, we'll see later on when we get into theodicies, an attempt to vindicate the goodness of God in the face of evil. St. Augustine in particular will make the case that evil doesn't exist. Evil is not a thing. So God could not be responsible for it. I'll come back to that. That was just a little commercial for later. One way around this, though, is to say, fine, evil exists, but it is not gratuitous. It is not unnecessary evil. It's the kind of evil that seems way worse than it actually is from our perspective, because we're merely finite mortal beings. Again, that's something we'll return to when we go into the free will theodicy and we look at something called the parent analogy, but that's for later. Here's Rowe's manifestation of the argument, or representation of the argument as we just gave it. On 247, he breaks it into two premises and a conclusion, and I'll just read it. He says, Premise 1, there exist instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. That's a bit of a mouthful. What he means is some suffering, if it's used to, say, improve one's character, one's capacity to do something, right? My children suffer on occasion, but they are better for it. They have to suffer through school. They have to suffer through activities to make them better in shape and so forth. You can go the other direction too when he says, without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some equally bad that is equally bad or worse. Giving a shot, letting a doctor give my child a shot, a vaccine, does cause harm. We might even call it an evil. But to not give them that shot, to not vaccinate them, to not give them the MMR shot, the measles, mumps, rubella shot, could lead to greater harm. And in fact, we know that it does. So vaccinate your children, please. Measles should have been eradicated. We should not be dealing with measles still. In any case, premise 2. An omniscient, wholly good being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering that it could, unless it could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Do you see how that parallels the first premise? His conclusion, however, there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good being. Why is that? Because there are evils in the world that are gratuitous, that are extra, that are unnecessary, right? And it's of the sort that causes suffering that should not be, we might say, in defense of premise 4 from the first argument, that there is evil. Rowe's argument expands on this, and he points out that within that argument that I just gave you, premise 2, an omniscient, wholly good being would prevent an occurrence of any intense suffering it could, unless, there's the key point, that both atheists and theists would accept, unless it could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Excuse me. Premise 2 is acceptable, and most theists would accept it, and atheists accept it too. The premise that is in contention, of course, is premise 1, which Rowe, I think, accurately states, is only supported by atheists. That it is a fact that there are instances of intense suffering that are, to shorten it, that are gratuitous, that don't bring about a greater good, that don't avoid a more horrible thing happening. And his example is compelling. And of course, it's difficult if you're fans of, Bambi, is it? He says, suppose in some distant forest, this is 248, lightning strikes a dead tree, resulting in a forest fire. In the fire, a fawn is trapped, horribly burned, and lies in terrible agony for several days before death relieves it of suffering. I told you this is going to be graphic. We're almost done, so stick with it. Actually, this is a recording. You can stop any time and then come back after having watched a comedy. That's actually not a bad idea. I should have said that earlier, like an hour ago. You should break this up and watch comedies in between it. So, if you wish, you can do that. You can do that mid-sentence of this quote and then come back to the lecture. Anyway, so where was I? Fawn, which I've pictured there, just to give you the emotional content, struck by lightning, not dead, but in horrible agony for like 3 days, and then it dies. So far as we can see, the fawn's intense suffering is pointless, that is gratuitous, for there does not appear to be any greater good such that the prevention of the fawn's suffering would require either the loss of that good or the occurrence of an evil equally bad or worse. Nor does there seem to be any equally bad or worse evil so connected to the fawn's suffering that it would have had to occur had the fawn's suffering been prevented. Could God have stopped this? Could God had allowed the fawn to be struck by lightning and then to have died immediately? It would be odd to think an omnipotent being lacked that power. And yet, this thought experiment is of course more than a thought experiment. It is surely the case that things like this happen every single day and have happened every single day going back to the time of the dinosaurs. Millions and millions of years of collected, gratuitous agony. That's not the end, by the way. Sorry, that sounded like end of lecture. That would have been really shitty. I'm going to end on a positive note, okay? We're just not there yet. How do you respond to this? Now, Rowe makes the case that it is a valid argument. That is to say, if the premises are true, they necessitate the truth of the conclusion. Remember, the conclusion is there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, holy, good being. Now, to show that that's the case, he has to show that the premises are in fact true. We already found that the theist and atheist alike accept premise 2, so we don't need to worry about that one. It's premise 1. Premise 1 has to be addressed by the theist. And a direct attack on premise 1, which is to say that, no, it's just plain false. There are instances of intense suffering, and they are there for a greater good. But notice that direct attack would have to address not just the fawn example, because the fawn example is one of billions. The theist would have to make the case that all suffering of that sort could be explained and as necessary for some greater good or for avoiding some worse evil. That is implausible in the extreme, says Rowe. But he gives another option. Perhaps the theist will take a more indirect approach. Instead of saying directly premise 1 is false, and I can give counterexamples to premise 1, the theist might say, well, wait a minute. What if we engage in some clever logical moves? And here he introduces the contemporary philosopher. He calls it it's referenced the Moore shift, named after G.E. Moore. Excuse me. And in this particular account, he's trying to show that the theist can represent their argument as another competing valid argument. It's called the Moore shift because Moore uses this, G.E. Moore, in the early 20th century philosopher, to argue against skepticism. There was an attempt at showing that, how do we know we even exist? How do we know we have a hand in front of us? How do I know I'm awake and not dreaming? And so on. And what grounds could we refute the skeptics? If the skeptic's argument was set up and was as valid as its counter. And by the way, if an argument is valid, it's no more or less valid than any other valid argument. So for instance, I'll give the example slide 38 here. 38 slides, wow. Sorry about that. Premise 1. If I cannot tell the difference between waking and dreaming, then I cannot be sure that I have a body. Premise 2. I cannot tell the difference between waking and dreaming, therefore it follows that I cannot be sure that I have a body. That argument is a deductively valid proof. It's properly formed. It is the form of modus ponens, that is the way of positing. If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. Anything you plug into that would be a valid argument, meaning if the premises are all true, then the conclusion follows with necessity. Validity is unconcerned with actual real-world truth value, just to remind us of that discussion we had months ago now. Now turn it around. Here's the shift. The skeptic gives us this example that I cannot be sure that I have a body. Well, here is an equally valid argument because it is a valid construction. Premise 1, if I cannot tell the difference between my waking and dreaming state, then I cannot be sure that I have a body. That's the same exact premise of the previous argument. But notice, premise 2 is different. Premise 2 in the first argument says I can't tell the difference between waking and dreaming. Premise 2 in the Moore's shift is I can tell that I have a body. Notice what that's done, right? I can tell that I have a body. It follows that I can tell the difference between waking and dreaming. As one logician has put it, one man's modus ponens is another's modus tollens. Some logical humor for you. Modus ponens is a deductively valid form. If P, then Q. P, therefore Q. Modus tollens, also a deductively valid argument. If P, then Q. Not Q, therefore not P. I'm denying a necessary condition is being met. And if I deny that a necessary condition has been met, then that, in this case, P, cannot be the case. And here I give you a quickie on deduction. Modus tollens, known as the way of removing. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. To give an example, if I am a philosopher, then I am wealthy. I'm not wealthy, then I am not a philosopher. Notice the Moore shift again. If P, then Q, P, therefore Q, that's valid. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P, also valid. His point, that was a bit quick, I understand, in just listening to it, but when you look back through page 250 and 251, his point is the theist can construct we can construct a counter argument to the initial argument that he gives us on 247, 248 that is equally valid. And then we get, according to Rowe, to a position where we have to evaluate our presuppositions. What makes the most sense? Which version is more rational? So the argument is simply, and he'll put it this way, here's the shift. This is 251, applying the G.E. Moore shift against the first premise of the basic argument for theism, right? This is the theist's indirect move. The theist can argue as follows. Not 3. That's saying the third claim in our first argument is not the case. Because the claim is, number 1, there exists an omnipotent, omniscient, and holy good being. Claim 2, an omniscient, holy good being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering it could, unless it could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil, equally bad or worse. Therefore, it follows that it is not the case that there exist instances of suffering, intense suffering, which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil, equally bad or worse. In other words, this is the opposite. This is the modus tollens of the modus ponens version, so to speak, that we said before. Which one is more valid? That's an absurd question. They're equally valid, but they have opposite conclusions. The theist's conclusion is that there are no gratuitous evils, right? And that argument is valid if the premises, and again on page 251, if the premises of that argument are true, then the conclusion follows with necessity. Now, for Rowe, we ask, which is more appealing to common sense? You see what I did there? Because it's G-E, more. And I spelled out more. Appealing. It's funnier in a classroom, I'm sure. What do we now think? That premise 1 in the original argument, which, remind you, there are instances of gratuitous suffering. Is that likely the case or likely false? Rowe will allow, and he'll call himself a friendly atheist, he will allow that one can be rational and yet accept what he takes to be the false belief that there is no gratuitous evil. That's a confusing way of putting it. Rowe wants to say the theist can be a rational person and yet deny that there are gratuitous evils. Now he wants to distinguish himself from the unfriendly atheist who claims, in short, no one is rationally justified in the belief in a theistic God. And he's also distinguishing himself from the indifferent atheist who just doesn't give a damn. He calls himself a friendly atheist. Some theists these are people, the friendly atheist is one who believes that theists can be rational and potentially even justified in beliefs that turn out to be false. And he gives an example, this is 252, he says, suppose your friends see you off on a flight to Hawaii. Hours after takeoff, they learn that your plane has gone down at sea. After 24 hours search, no survivors have been found. Under these circumstances, they are rationally justified in believing, in this case a false belief, that you have perished. But it is hardly rational for you to believe this, as you bob up and down in your life vest, wondering why the search planes have failed to spot you, and on it goes. That's a rational belief that is false. And immediately it came to mind when Lola and Milo, each of them when they were like 3 or 4, and told by everyone, most importantly their parents, well, their mom more than me, but in any case, that Santa Claus exists. The belief that Santa Claus exists is a false belief, but it's not rationally unjustified in the 3 and 4-year-old's case. Right? They're being told by everyone that they trust that Santa exists. And no one is giving them counter evidence, not even the meteorologist, telling the kids that, hey, we saw Santa over in Solvang or whatever. To the 4-year-old, the evidence is such that it's rational to believe. Now, Rowe seems to say we can utilize this kind of friendly atheism with respect to the question of the argument from evil. And this is a compromise, which of course leaves everyone pissed off, because the atheists, who are the more hardcore or unfriendly atheists, might say something like, well, wait a minute, are you equating the theist in this particular argument with ignorant children? That actually is upsetting to both theists, one would expect, and atheists too, who say you ought not be so friendly toward them if, after all, you're calling them ignorant children who should know better. Who doesn't have the data from extrapolatable, to use the language from Robin Collins, right, where we can extrapolate from other experiences that there are suffering, there is evil, there is horrible, horrible suffering that seems to be wholly gratuitous. Is that rational to hold that it's not gratuitous? So that's the question I'm going to leave you with. Can we make sense of suffering that seems to us wholly gratuitous, but may in fact have a greater good or greater purpose to it. We could say God works in mysterious ways. That's fine, as long as that's at the very end of our logical, philosophical, moral reasoning. You do not start with that. That's a conversation ender. That's a thought ender. What else can we extrapolate from? And so there's a number of issues that this is going to raise. I don't want to go on and on. I said I was going to end on a happy note. That's actually not true. The last words I have are, thus everyone is pissed off. So I apologize if you were waiting for something great at the end here. Yeah, it's not. I don't have anything positive. Other than that it's sunny out right now, but gosh, I guess when you listen to this it might not be. Watch some comedies. Consider responses to this. Are there situations in which evil can be seen as necessary even though it appears gratuitous? And a further point, even if you can make the case that there's no such thing as gratuitous evils, all suffering is necessary, is that a saving grace for God? Doesn't that make God a divine utilitarian? Do that which will bring about the greatest good in the end. That means suffering is part and parcel, is built into the design for something in the future. I didn't talk about Dostoevsky today, and I'm not going to burden you more with the horrors and tribulations of suffering, but if you have time to read Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov in his section called Rebellion, in fact maybe I'll post it there, suggested reading, you'll see that it's not obvious that a utilitarian approach to God is a positive one and will save or vindicate the goodness of God, even if we invoke heaven in the end. All right, let's end with that, with the word, at least the word heaven. That's nice. Okay. Have a good day.